Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty interesting. It's called the Alien Enemies Act.
Oh, okay.
It was passed way back in 1798, so it's been kicking around for a while. And essentially what it does is it gives a whole lot of power to the executive branch when it comes to dealing with citizens of enemy nations during, times of war or if there's an invasion.
Right.
But the reason why this is particularly interesting for us right now is because of what President Trump did in 2025. He invoked this act targeting specifically Venezuelan nationals who are allegedly connected to a gang called Tren de Aragua.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting because if you look back historically,
Right.
the Alien Enemies Act has almost always only been used during times when there was a formally declared war.
Right.
So this move by President Trump is a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
It's like the first time we're seeing it used during peacetime.
Right.
And not only that, it's being applied to a group that's not even a nation state.
Right.
We're talking about a criminal gang here.
Right. So essentially, we're going to try and unpack all of this, right? We're going to look back at where this act came from, go through the times it's been used before, and then really dig into this 2025 invocation and see what kind of legal and political, debates it's stirred up.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. Way
Okay.
back in 1798, what was going on that led to this act being passed in the first place?
Right.
Uh,
Okay. So let's go all the way back to 1798. Can you kind of set the scene for us? What led to the creation of this Alien Enemies Act?
So you got to imagine America's still pretty young, right? It's
Right.
1798, and there's this tension brewing with France, this thing called the Quasi-War.
Okay.
Basically an undeclared naval conflict. Things are heated.
Yeah.
You've got the Federalists in control of Congress, President John Adams at the helm, and they pass a whole set of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Right.
And the Alien Enemies Act is just one piece of that puzzle.
Okay. So national security was obviously like a big reason behind this whole thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. But when you dig a little deeper, you see there's more to it than just protecting the nation.
Okay.
The Federalists, they weren't huge fans of immigrants, especially those who seemed to sympathize with the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw these folks as potential allies of their political rivals, the
Yeah.
Democratic Republicans.
Right. So it's kind of like they were using this fear of foreign influence to silence their opponents.
You could say that.
Okay. That makes sense. So out of these four acts that you mentioned, why is it that the Alien Enemies Act is the one that stuck around for so long?
Well, the other three acts, they dealt with things like how long an immigrant had to wait to become a citizen or how to deal with foreigners from friendly nations. And then there was one specifically aimed at cracking down on anyone speaking out against the government.
Right. So those were more controversial in a way, right? They impacted a lot more people.
Exactly. They were seen as overreaching,
Mm.
and they eventually got repealed or just expired. But the Alien Enemies Act, it was more narrowly focused. It only really kicked in during times of war and only applied to people from enemy countries.
Okay. So because it wasn't used that, often people weren't as concerned about it, right?
That's part of it. And even back then, people were worried about national security.
Right.
So having this tool in the back pocket, just in case, made sense to some folks.
So what exactly could the president do under this act? I mean, what kind of powers did it give them?
Basically, it gave the president the power to arrest, detain, secure, and even remove non-citizens from enemy nations if there was a declared war or an invasion.
And that could happen, without any proof that these individuals were actually doing something wrong?
Yeah, that's a key point.
Yeah.
It didn't matter if someone was just living their life peacefully.
Right.
If they were from an enemy country and there was a war on, that was enough.
Wow. So it seems like a lot of power even for wartime. Were there any people back then who criticized this act?
Oh, absolutely. Some
Yeah.
big names like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison spoke out against it. They thought it went against the Constitution, especially when it came to due process rights and freedom of speech.
So basically the idea that you can't just lock people up without giving them a fair chance to defend themselves?
Exactly. And that's important to remember as we go forward.
Right. So this act has been around for centuries. How has it actually been used throughout history?
Well, before President Trump's move in 2025, there were 3 times it was invoked, each during a major war.
Okay. Let's walk through those, starting with the War of 1812.
All right, so in 1812, President Madison used the act against British nationals living in the U.S. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a war with Britain.
Exactly. It was all about dealing with citizens of a hostile nation during a time of open conflict.
So what did they do with these British citizens?
The main thing was they made them register with local authorities. But, from the records we have, it seems like enforcement wasn't that strict.
Okay, so not a huge impact.
Not really. Now, fast forward to World War I, things get a bit more intense.
Okay, how so?
So in 1917, the U.S. joins World War I, and President Wilson invokes the Alien Enemies Act, this time against German and Austro-Hungarian nationals.
Okay, and I'm guessing the measures taken were more serious this time around?
Oh, yeah. It wasn't just about registration anymore.
Right.
They were banned from owning firearms and radios. There were travel restrictions. And a big one, thousands of them were detained in government camps.
Wow, that's a huge escalation from just having to register.
And there's another change during World War I. They actually amended the act to specifically include women.
Oh, wow, so before that it only applied to men.
Yeah, seems crazy now, right?
Yeah.
But it shows you how wartime anxieties can lead to pretty drastic measures.
So then we come to World War II, which I know is considered the most controversial use of this act. What made it so different?
Well, after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt invokes the act again. This time it's against Japanese, German, and Italian nationals.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really messy.
Okay.
This is when you get Executive Order 9066.
For the internment of Japanese Americans.
Exactly. And while the Alien Enemies Act on its own only applied to non-citizens, this executive order led to the mass relocation and internment of over 120,000 people of Japanese descent.
And most of those people were actually American citizens, right?
You got, 2/3 were U.S. citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So even though the act was supposed to be about enemy aliens, it ended up being used to justify the detention of American citizens based solely on their ancestry.
It's really hard to believe that something like that happened in America.
It's a dark chapter, for sure. Even though the Supreme Court initially upheld these actions, it's been widely condemned since. It's a stark reminder of how national security concerns can be twisted to violate civil liberties.
Right, and it makes you think about what kind of safeguards we need to make sure something like that never happens again.
Absolutely. Especially since these laws like the Alien Enemies Act are still on the books.
Okay, so with all that history in mind, let's jump to 2025 President Trump's invocation of the act. What exactly happened?
So on March 15, 2025, President Trump decides to use the Alien Enemies Act. This time, it's aimed at members and suspected associates of a Venezuelan gang called Tren de Aragua.
And this is where it gets really unprecedented, right?
Exactly, because we're not talking about a declared war.
Right.
And Tren de Aragua, they're not a country. They're a criminal organization.
So essentially, the Trump administration is trying to expand the definition of what an enemy is under this act.
They're pushing the boundaries, for sure.
Okay, so what was their justification for invoking the act in this way?
They claimed that Tren de Aragua was basically an invading force that posed a serious threat to national security.
Because of their criminal activities, right?
Right. They pointed to things like drug trafficking, extortion, violent crimes, all that.
Okay, but those are crimes that happen within the U.S., right? Not some kind of foreign invasion.
That's the argument many people are making. How can you equate a criminal gang to a literal invasion by a foreign power?
Right, and the act itself talks about citizens or subjects of enemy nations or governments. How do they get around that?
Well, there was no declaration of war against Venezuela. And Tren de Aragua is not a sovereign nation with a government in the traditional sense.
So this was a huge departure from how the act has been understood and applied in the past.
Absolutely.
So what happened to the people who were targeted under this invocation?
Well, reports indicate that people suspected of being linked to Tren de Aragua were detained without the usual legal hearings, and they were deported without the chance to appeal in court.
So they were basically denied due process.
Exactly. And then there's this whole other layer of controversy.
Okay.
The administration made a deal with El Salvador. They paid them $6 million to detain 300 of these deported people for a whole year.
So instead of detaining them in the U.S., they sent them to another country.
Yeah, and critics are saying this is a way to get around U.S. law and avoid having to provide legal protections.
And was there any transparency around all of this? Like, did they release a list of who was targeted?
Nope, nothing like that. No list of names, no evidence made public, and no clear way for individuals to challenge their alleged gang affiliation.
So basically, it was all very secretive and lacked basic due process safeguards.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, this whole thing caused a lot of legal and political backlash.
Okay, let's dig into the legal arguments first. What were the main points raised against this invocation?
The biggest point was about the whole definition of enemy in the act.
Right.
Critics argued that a criminal gang, no matter how dangerous, does not fit the legal definition of an enemy nation or government.
And of course, the fact that there was no declared war also played a big role.
Absolutely. Using this act during peacetime without a declaration of war is seen as a major overreach.
And what about the due process concerns that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, that was a central issue too. Deporting people without hearings, without lawyers, without a chance to defend themselves.
Right.
It completely bypasses the normal immigration court system and raises serious constitutional questions.
Okay, so legally speaking, this move was highly questionable. Now, what about the political fallout? How did different sides react?
Well, as you can imagine, it was very divided. People who supported the Trump administration, especially conservative lawmakers and media outlets, they praised it.
Right.
They called it a tough but necessary step to secure the border and fight dangerous gangs.
So their argument was that we need to use any means necessary to protect the country.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you had the opponents, mostly civil liberties groups and immigration advocates.
Right.
They were outraged. They saw it as a blatant abuse of power, a discriminatory attack on immigrant communities.
So they were concerned about the potential for this to be used against other groups in the future.
Absolutely. And some Democrats in Congress even tried to get the act repealed and started investigations into how the administration was using it.
So this quickly escalated beyond just a policy debate.
Definitely. It went straight to the courts.
Okay, so what were the main legal challenges filed against this invocation?
Well, groups like the ACLU and Democracy Forward filed a lawsuit arguing that this whole thing was unconstitutional and unlawful.
Okay, and what were their main arguments?
They had a few key points. They said that deporting people without any hearings charges or evidence was a violation of the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause.
Right, the idea that even non-citizens have some basic rights to fair treatment.
Exactly. They also argued that the act can only be used during a declared war or a foreign invasion, and that a criminal gang's activities don't qualify as an invasion.
And I imagine they also brought up the separation of powers issue.
You got it. They argued that immigration policy is mainly the responsibility of Congress, and that the president can't just unilaterally change the rules by using a wartime law.
Okay, so what was the court's response to all of this?
Well, a federal judge in D.C. issued a temporary restraining order, or TRO, to stop any more deportations.
Okay, so they basically put a halt to the whole thing.
At least temporarily. The judge thought that the plaintiffs had a good chance of winning the case, especially when it came to the due process and the whole definition of invasion.
Right, and wasn't there also a pretty dramatic moment where the judge ordered flights carrying deportees to turn around?
Yeah, that was a big deal. The judge literally said, "Stop those planes."
Wow, so what happened? Did the administration actually comply?
Well, reports say they didn't. The flights continued, which is a pretty serious challenge to the court's authority.
So they basically ignored a direct order from a federal judge?
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And legal experts were really alarmed by this. They saw it as a dangerous disregard for the rule of law.
Right. So how did the Trump administration respond to this whole legal challenge and the TRO?
They didn't back down at all. They went on the offensive, publicly defending their actions and even criticizing the courts.
So they were basically saying that the judges were overstepping their bounds and interfering with national security.
That was their message. They claimed that the threat from Tren de Aragua was so urgent that they had to act, and the courts were getting in the way.
And they also used this opportunity to attack the judiciary more broadly, right?
Yeah, they basically revived those old accusations of judges being activist judges who were out of touch with the real world.
And I'm sure conservative media outlets amplified this message.
Oh, absolutely. They framed it as a classic case of liberal judges trying to undermine the president's efforts to keep the country safe.
So legally, what did they do to fight the TRO?
The Justice Department filed an appeal to try to get the TRO overturned.
Okay.
And in their legal arguments, they doubled down on the idea that the president has broad power when it comes to national security and immigration.
And I bet they also tried to justify their interpretation of invasion to include criminal gangs.
Exactly. They were trying to create a legal precedent that would allow them to use the Alien Enemies Act in this way.
And this whole refusal to comply with the court order, that's a really worrying sign, right?
Yeah, it raises serious concerns about the separation of powers and the future of the rule of law.
So even if they eventually lose this legal battle, the implications of this whole episode could be huge.
Oh, absolutely. No matter what happens, this is a watershed moment. It's really forced us to confront some fundamental questions about presidential power, civil liberties, and the role of the courts.
So let's talk about the potential long-term implications of all of this. What could this mean for executive power in the future?
Well, if the courts ultimately side with the Trump administration, it could significantly expand presidential power, especially during times of crisis.
Right, because it would set a precedent for presidents to use this act against a wide range of groups, not just during wartime.
Exactly. It could normalize the use of emergency powers in situations that don't really warrant it.
And what about the impact on civil liberties, especially for non-citizens?
That's a huge concern. Applying the Alien Enemies Act without due process protections opens the door to potential abuse.
Right.
It could mean that people are detained or deported based on flimsy evidence or just because they belong to a certain group.
So we could see a rise in profiling, discrimination, and surveillance, especially targeting immigrant communities.
It's a real possibility.
Yeah.
And then there's the impact on the courts and the whole system of checks and balances.
Right, because if the executive branch can just ignore court orders, it undermines the entire system.
Exactly. The courts are supposed to be a check on executive power. But if presidents feel like they can just disregard judicial rulings, it sets a dangerous precedent.
And finally, let's not forget about that deal with El Salvador. What are the long-term implications of outsourcing detention like that?
That's a new and troubling development. It raises all sorts of questions about accountability and human rights.
Right, because once people are sent to another country, it's much harder to ensure that their rights are being protected.
Exactly. And there are concerns about the conditions in these foreign detention centers and whether people have any legal recourse.
So as we wrap up here, it's clear that this 2025 invocation of the Alien Enemies Act is a major turning point. It's brought up all these fundamental issues about our democracy and the balance of power.
It really has. And it's forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how far we're willing to go in the name of national security.
So what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't just assume that our laws and institutions will always protect us. We have to be vigilant. We have to understand the history of these laws, like the Alien Enemies Act, and be aware of how they can be misused.
Because even though this act was passed centuries ago, it's still relevant today. It shows us that the potential for government overreach is always there.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we have to constantly be defending our rights and holding our leaders accountable.
So this whole episode is really a call to action for our listeners to stay informed, stay engaged, and make sure that these kinds of abuses of power don't go unchecked.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. I really appreciate you taking the time to break down this complex issue for us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Alien Enemies Act. It's a topic that deserves our attention, and I hope this conversation has encouraged you to learn more and to stay engaged in the ongoing debates about national security and civil liberties.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.